Welcome back to the Food for the Faithful channel, which is my greatest source of cathartic relief. With me, your host, Bill Reimer, your reluctant prophet. And boy, do I have a topic for you today. We're going to examine mass murder resulting from totalitarian tyranny, which is broken down into three categories. That of democide, the murder of any person or people by a government; mortocracy, a type of political system that habitually and systemically murders large numbers of its own citizens; and mega murderer, a government that has murdered over 1 million people or more. During the 20th century, governments murdered over 200 million people. This figure excludes battle deaths from wars. The tables below, which you'll see in my notes, since I always plug my video into my blog, the tables below are from just published article, Guns Kill People and Tyrants with Gun Monopolies Kill the Most. 25 Gazanga Journal of International Law 29 from 2021. The data covers 1900 to 1987 and is mainly based on the scholarship of the late University of Hawaii political science professor Rudolph J. Rummel. The few instances in which different figures are used are explained in my article. And again, I provide the link to this article below my reading. The tables below do not use the word genocide because that term is defined in the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide as too narrow. At the insistence of Joseph Stalin, the Genocide Convention applies to some mass murders by government, e.g. targeting racial, ethnic, or religious groups, but not to others, e.g. targeting victims for class warfare or ideological reasons. Hence, Professor Rummel coined the term democide to describe non-combat mass murder for any reason. As the tables indicate, mass murders are perpetrated by dictatorial regimes of various stripes. Communist regimes are far away the most murderous. The tables list 17 communist countries, or regimes rather, that murdered at least 100,000 people. Overall, the communists murdered approximately 168,759,000 from 1900 to 1987. On the whole, the most murderous fascist regime proved to be less durable than their communist counterparts, so their killing sprees did not last as long. The 1900 to 1987 murder count by fascist regimes was 27,848,000. Fascist regimes are those that were explicitly aligned with the political theories of Italian dictator Benito Mussolini. Mussolini had been a socialist, but he broke with the party because of its international class perspective in its opposition to World War I. Mussolini recast the totalitarian side of some socialist ideologies into a nationalist mold. All these figures are rough midpoint estimates. They come from a scholar who dedicated his outstanding career to quantifying mass murder by government and examining its causes. Table 1, mega murders, over 1 million victims, regime years, democide in the millions, and the summary. A, decamurders, over 10 million victims. People's Republic of China, 1949 to 87. 87.6 million people murdered. Mao et al. Communist regime. Does not include 3.5 million murders by Chinese communists during the 1927 to 49 Civil War. Union of the Soviet Socialist Republics, 1917 to 87. 61.9 million people murdered. Communist regime. Includes 54.8 million within the Soviet Union, plus 6.9 million in areas conquered by the USSR. Joseph Stalin's rule from 1929 to 53 accounts for 43 million. On an annualized basis, the pre-Stalin regime founded by Lenin was more murderous than the post-Stalin one. Germany, 1933 to 45, 20.9 million people murdered. National Socialist Workers' Party includes the Nazis, includes Hitler's regime murders through occupied Europe. Does not include World War II battle deaths. China, 1928 to 49, 10.1 million people murdered. The Kuomintang Party. Although the party was originally Leninist in orientation, I did not count them in the communist total. B. Mega murderers. Over 1 million victims. Japan, 1936 to 45, 6 million people murdered. Military dictatorship. Principally war crimes perpetrated by the Japanese army against civilians in occupied nations such as China or in the Philippines. Although the ideology was not derived from Mussolini, the regime allied with European fascists in World War II, and Japan is therefore counted as a fascist regime. China, 1923 to 49, 3.5 million people murdered. Communist Revolutionary Army before victory in 49. As with all the data, there are no battle deaths. The killings were of civilians in areas controlled by the Communist Army. Cambodia, 1975 to 79, 1.5 million people murdered. Khmer Rouge Communist Party, per capita the largest democide against a domestic population, includes murders of ethnic minorities, intellectuals, and dissidents, plus deaths from slave labor. Turkey, 1909 to 1918, 1.9 million people murdered. Young Turks regime, military dictatorship, killings of Armenians and other Christians. Vietnam, 1945 to 87, 1.7 million people murdered. Communists, includes 1.1 million in Vietnam and 0.6 million in Laos and Cambodia. Does not include battle deaths. Poland, 1945 to 48, 1.6 million people murdered. Communist regime post-World War II. Ethnic cleansing of German population, including in former German areas given to Poland after the war. Deaths mainly from subhuman conditions of deportation. Pakistan, 1970 to 71, 1.5 million people murdered. Islamist military dictatorship. A 267-day military attack by West Pakistan on East Pakistan, which is now the independent nation of Bangladesh. The attacks were ended by the Indian military intervention. The figure does not include battle deaths. Yugoslavia, 1945 to 1963, 1.1 million people murdered. Joseph Broz Tito communist dictatorship. Mass killings of ethnic groups and non-communists in 45 to 46, plus deaths in slave labor camps through to 1963. Suspected mega murders. Data are less certain, so estimates are rougher. North Korea, from 1948 to 87, 1.7 million people murdered. Sung's family communist absolute monarchy includes killings of prisoners of war and civilian South Koreans during the Korean War from 1950 to 1953. Mexico, 1900 to 1920, 1.4 million people murdered. Porfirio Diaz authoritarian regime till 1911, revolutionary regimes and warlords thereafter. Deaths of Indians and peons on slave labor haciendas, plus massacre of civilians and conscription into slave labor by various forces in the civil wars between 1911 and 1920. Russia, 1900 to 1917, 1.1 million people murdered. Tsarist regime. Includes about 500,000 from Russian Empire Armenian irregulars slaughtering Kurds in Turkey in World War I in reprisal for the genocide of Armenians in Turkey. Most of the rest from deaths of prisoners of war in World War I. Some from Jewish pogroms. Total death of mega murders, 203.6 1.5 million. Table 2. Next largest European domestic mass murder, regime years, democide, and summary. Albania, 1944 to 87, 100,000 people murdered, communist. Ultra-totalitarian regime, Enver Hoxha. Balkan Christians, 1912 to 1913, 10,000 people murdered, targeted by various governments. Bulgaria, 1944 to 87, 222,000 people murdered, communist. Czechoslovakia, 1945 to 48, 197,000 people murdered, coalition government including Democrats and communists. Primarily reprisals and ethnic cleansing of German-speaking population. The figure is not included in the communist total above. East Germany, from 45 to 87, 70,000 people murdered, communist. Hungary, 1919 to 44, 138,000 people murdered, authoritarian, including 79,000 in Yugoslavia, in areas temporarily annexed by Hungary in World War II, included in the fascist total because Hungary was an ally of Nazi Germany. Romania, 1941 to 87, 919,000 people murdered, fascist then communist after 44. For simplicity, half the deaths are assigned to communists and half to fascists. Spain, 1936 to 1975, 452,000 people murdered, fascist Francisco Franco dictatorship, mutual democide of 202,000 by fascists and Republicans during the Civil War, 250,000 by Franco thereafter. For simplicity, half the Civil War deaths are assigned to fascists. Although many communists fought in the Civil War against Franco, the deaths from the anti-Franco side are not assigned to communists. Total of other European mass murders, 2,108,000. Table 3. Selected centi kilo murders, over 100,000. Regime years, democide, and summary. Afghanistan, 1978 to 87, 483,000 people murdered. Does not include battle deaths. Includes democides by pre-79 regime, by the regime installed in 1979 by the Soviet coup, by the imperialist Soviet army, and by other forces. Angola, 1975 to 87, 125,000 people murdered by communist regimes following independence from Portugal. Burundi, 1964 to 87, 175,000 people murdered. Tutsis versus Hutus. China, 1917 to 49, 910,000 people murdered by warlords. Independent warlord regimes not under the control of the People's Republic China or of the communist revolutionaries. Ethiopia, from 1941 to 74, 148,000 people murdered under Haile Selassie's monarchy. Ethiopia, 1974 to 87, 725,000 people murdered, communist. Guatemala, 1956 to 87, 122,000 people murdered, military dictatorship. Indonesia, 1965 to 66, 509,000 people murdered. 509,000 people murdered. Killings of communists by the military, the selected militia, and others followed a failed communist coup attempt. Indonesia, from 65 to 87, 729,000 people murdered against East Timor secessionists. Iraq, from 68 to 87, 187,000 people murdered by the Ba'ath Party, although the party had explicitly Stalinist and Hitlerist roots. The deaths are not assigned to either ideology. Mongolia, from 1916 to 87, 100,000 people murdered, communist. Mozambique, 1975 to 87, 323,000 people murdered, 198,000 by communist regime after 1975 independence from Portugal. Remainder by opposition Renamo forces, Resistência Nacional Mozambicana. Nigeria, 1967 to 70, 777,000 people murdered by government and Biafran forces during Biafra's failed War of Independence. Sudan, 1956 to 87, 620,000 people murdered, Islamist military dictatorship against various ethnic or racial minorities. Turkey, 1919 to 1923, 878,000 people murdered, Ataturk regime, post-World War attacks on Armenians and other minorities. Uganda, 1971 to 79, 300,000 people murdered, Idi Amin military regime, mainly against minority tribes and Ugandans of Asian descent. Uganda, 1979 to 87, 255,000 people murdered, post-Amin regime. Total 7,373,000 deaths for a grand total of 212,981,000 deaths. Figures are for the years 1900 to 1987, and therefore do not include mass murders by government in the last 35 years, such as ongoing Chinese Communist imperialist genocides in Central Asians against Tibetans, Uyghurs, and other groups. As detailed in my article and citations therein, the overwhelming majority of the above murder were perpetrated against victims who had been assiduously disarmed by dictatorships before the killing began. Yes, assiduously disarmed, just like Canada. The behavior and statement of mass murdering regimes indicate that armed victims are a serious impediment to mass murder by government. Remember that. As also detailed in the art of the historical record, indicates that resistance by intended victims who do have arms can save many lives, even when the targeted groups lack the power to overthrow the regime. This takes me back to the 1837-1838 rebellion by Mackenzie and Papineau. They might have failed, but the Baldwin Act resulted from it. And Mother Country finally granted Canada, united the two provinces into the first version of Canada, the United Provinces of Canada, and gave us limited suffrage. Resistance is never futile. I provide the link to this article. Please read it yourself. I never ask anyone to believe a single thing that I'm telling you. Don't believe me. Believe the evidence of your own eyes. Do your own research. Now, what is the point of today's little dissertation and naughtiness? In a commencement address to graduating students at Boston's Northeast University in May, Deputy Prime Minister Chrystia Freeland said the fundamental question of our time is, does capitalist democracy still work? Yes, the very system of government that ostensibly allows her to serve as a minister, she claims is no longer viable. Well, frankly, if she is the result of democracy and capitalism, she may well be right. Can you believe that the Deputy Prime Minister of Canada went and gave an address to graduating students in a foreign country, our closest neighbor, and stated that democracy and capitalism no longer work compared to what? The 212,981,000 people that were murdered by totalitarian regimes? This woman is a maniacal lunatic. How is it that you're not out in the streets demanding that this government fall? I don't understand you. I cannot understand why you're not raging against the machine that perpetrates its vast fraud against you, the common people of Canada. These are things to think and pray about if ever we had a reason to think and pray. Start thinking and then pray. Because once you understand what's going on, you're going to pray for God's help. That's for darn sure. Because there's no way that we're going to extricate ourselves out of this dystopian nightmare without His help.